Well, it's a puppet based on the sort of Handspring aesthetic, and Handspring are the people who made the puppets for Warhorse. And they based it on a Michael Morpurgo novel, this guy here. And he kind of follows one character through a story, and the characters are often going through something quite traumatic and coming to terms with things. And I thought that fitted quite well into the whole refugee situation in Syria. So there's a Channel 4 documentary where they follow one family from Syria all the way to Germany. And there was one little girl in it who was sort of at the age where you wouldn't believe that they would be in that situation. And she deals with it in a really kind of admirable way. So I based the design on her. So that was just a sort of rough sketch to begin with. So I looked at her kind of gestures and got a feel for her personality and the way that she articulates things when she's communicating, and thought that she's probably, in a way, more sophisticated than this puppet would let on. This is a Handspring puppet, a child puppet, so it's very, flexy, but they've all got a maturity about them because of everything they've seen, so I thought that would kind of fit in better with the more sophisticated style of that puppet. So I've kind of basically tied the two together. And I've wanted to use wood because Handspring use wood pretty much for everything. So then it was just a case of figuring out how I was actually going to make it and keep that kind of skeletal look, because it's quite sparse the way they do things. So it's just a case of the joints, working out the proportions. And these were the other children, so I made sure that they're, I was assessing all the different characters that I could do and justifying why I was choosing the certain character I did. This is her sister, and this was their cousin. And another boy from a different village. He was very interesting, actually. He did sort of singing and protest marches. He was a real character. Very, very mature for his age, like ridiculously so. And then this is the girl I decided to stick with. And then she grows up during the film, so it was about trying to find a mid-ground between her when she's about 5 when they started, and 9 by the time they finished, and then choosing a facial expression that was fixed. So I wanted one that was almost suspended animation, so then you can, you can kind of portray whichever expression or whichever scenario you like onto that face. It's better than one that's completely sort of, And then, this was so you can see all the chisel marks with these ones, which actually, where the light plays off the chisel marks, you get your imagination flares up and you can put loads of different expressions onto those chisel marks. So I wanted it to be quite sort of rough finish for that reason. And I looked at different places that make different sorts of puppets. So there's some very sort of simple ones, foam. These ones were wood, but they were very kind of clunky. And then I went to talk to a puppeteer who'd worked on the puppet barge, so this one here. And she told me about how I would have the puppeteers working around her. So I'd have 3 puppeteers, one working the feet, one working the head and probably the left arm, and the other one working the sort of keeping the waist suspended and working on the right arm. And obviously everything changes around a bit, but kind of just gave me an idea of how heavy she could be and how much movement I needed to put into different parts. And then this was a proportional sketch just to work out exactly how tall. Oh, and there are these puppets, they're ones from France. Huge, huge puppets. And I'd just played around with how she'd look with a more articulate face, which is the main feature of those. Joint sketches to work out how I'd actually get everything to flex and to move. And then the anatomy, that was really difficult because you can't really, there's not much reference that I could find anyway on child anatomy. So it was just a case of getting kind of adult anatomy, studying that and then appropriating it to the proportions and of the child limbs that I was looking at. And hair, working out what I'd use for hair. So I did think about horse hair, but it was just a bit too realistic. It's a bit too sort of scraggly, I guess. And the Warhorse puppets used, I guess it was like paper, and the birds were made out of plastic bags, like bin bags, so it was quite kind of big. You can see the light playing off it far better when it's bigger strands. So I found that stuff that you make straw hats out of. So it's a bit floppier than raffia, but it's also made out of 100% wood, which was nice in terms of the quality of all the materials being wooden. And this was me returning to more research just to see how I could encompass different mechanisms. So I had some problems with the stomach, and I needed to go back to my research book whilst making and work out how I could add extra support and extra movement. So I just looked at bellows and how I could ensure maximum movement of the middle. And that was just a general summary, just to make sure I had all my little thoughts and details down before I started making. Well, I'd never worked in wood before, so I had a little go of doing some tiny little sort of faces there about that big, and some detail in slightly harder wood, just to get my hand in with the chisels a bit. And I made a little maquette just to sort of see how all the elements would work together in terms of the mechanisms, and whether one mechanism might take away from the general look. I also knew the hands were going to be a real challenge, so I decided to sculpt one to make sure I had the sizing right, and then moulded that in the same way I moulded my previous sculpture. So that was, cast, and then I took a cast of that, so it was all plasticine, so I could chop it up and mess around with it and just generally see what would look okay. And then it was just a case of getting on and making it. So I tested out the finger mechanism a bit, and then taking some measurements from the hand. So when it's like that, the dimensions are different to when it's like that. So I had to sculpt straight fingers behind the bent fingers so I could see the comparison and work out which static measurement I'd stick with, and then drew that up. So all of these are different depending on which finger it is. So they're all slightly different widths and things. These are the plan drawings, to just shove those in somewhere. So that was all the shapes. Cut all those shapes out, and then realised that the grain on the ply, because it was only 3 layered ply, because the grain was more dominant in one direction, I had to recut every single shape all over again. So I'm glad I kept those. Needed those again. Brought the spheres in, but then obviously had to joint them all and hollow them out and make sure the bungee could go through. This was the face progression, so I'd only carved those little ones, so it was a real challenge blowing it out big and making sure that looked okay. And the hairline makes a big difference, so I had to kind of make sure. And the eyes also, how I'd done the eyes, so I played with having the pupils with sort of etching them in, and then thought actually seeing the whole pupil wasn't any good, and it made her look a little bit more sort of open and responsive and slightly softer expression if I brought that pupil up a bit. So it's just little tweaks like that make a huge difference, because that's immediately where you look to. And Handspring said about having a dark pool for the eyes, so I didn't want to play around with doing too much in terms of detail in the face. This was a nightmare putting the head together. There's one moment where I heard this almighty crack, and I just sort of pulled it out, gave it a little shake. Everything stayed on, so I just sort of left that after that. It was a bit terrifying, but I had to just hollow everything out, which took forever, but it was important for everything to be light and manoeuvrable. And then this is dovetailing, just to make sure nothing, even if the glue wasn't quite strong enough, the dovetail would ensure that nothing would pull apart. And then attaching the blocks for the ears and the neck. That was me trying to, without anything too heavy, trying to glue on a bit of wood without a clamp that was big enough. So just a huge pile of books and things. Drilling in order to hollow out a bit quicker. So by that point I was trying to work out if there was a quicker way to do things. So this was me starting to do sort of the more aesthetic surface details. So the hair, knotting that on a bit of brass, and mapping out the t-shirt design, and just playing around with how that would look. And the feet, that was actually quite good fun. Started making 2 left feet and had to quickly correct that. For the arms I had to bend ash, so steam it in some boiling water and then just bend it around some poles. This is the stomach section to make sure, because the spine just wasn't strong enough to support the puppet and keep her from moving unnaturally. So that was ply shapes and extra large tights. Very nice tights actually, because I didn't want anything to snag, so they were spent more on those than I'd originally wanted. Putting the hair in, Bit of a cheat here, because obviously I didn't quite have enough hair to completely cover the head, so I had to paint the whole head black and add some sort of texture that would look like raffia even if it wasn't, so that if the wood did show through at any point you saw black rather than beige. Playing around with the eyebrows, that was a incredibly nerve-wracking point, because if I'd got that wrong then it would really have looked awful, so I just penciled on where I'd like them, and then it was just a case of slowly building up with a very, very light gouache coat. And again, glue in the stomach, that was fun because I'd already put the whole thing together by that point, so epoxy and Gorilla Glue to stop anything splurging out on me not being able to tidy it up. And then this is just some little paper cutouts to show where things would have to be cut in order for it to flex, and where to flex to, because obviously if it completely balled up that wouldn't be good, because it would all stop each other moving. And then that was the palm as well, that palm had to be taken down too. So after just doing that for a little while, it was just a case of drilling each, cutting little channels, putting in the brass stoppers and letting it all be free moving, and the wrist as well, just rounding things off in that respect too, just to allow for a little bit of movement there, otherwise it could look quite wooden, excuse the pun. And then these were the different, I had to work out a way of threading everything through. So this is just the ways that that's the elastic I used. A bit of clock wire, that proved very useful actually, not very strong, but got into those fine little drilled holes to pull the elastic through. Floristry wire. This is just for reference. If I do anything like this again, I know what it looks like, and I can ask a shop, exactly this please. And if possible, you have the packaging too. This is the Dacron line, fishing line. Very, very strong. Wasn't quite slippery enough, so I Mr. it to make sure that would all run nice and smoothly. Trying to work out how different lengthed fingers would all flex as much as they could, because obviously they'll only flex as the shortest finger, which took me ages to realise, but it only flex as far as the thumb will flex. So that was a case of making sure it all started at the right point, so then you got the full fist clench sort of look. Working out how I wanted the arm to move, because depending on where it was fixed on the shoulder would depend on at what angle it flexed as the full arm. So that was a really important decision to make, and that was all determined by where on the sphere I drilled. So I wanted to make sure I was drilling in exactly the right spot. Old beeswax and Danish oil, just working out which parts I wanted to be which colour, so differentiating between the hypothetically clothed elements and the skin. So the skin was beeswax, which gave it a slightly lighter glow, and the Danish oil makes it look wet basically, so it was quite dark. And just making sure the feet didn't do that. So adding some elastic just to give it a bit of bounce. So in Warhorse they add foam as well to stop things like clunking and clacking when the horse moves and it being too unnatural. And I had to reanalyse the anatomy because I wasn't quite happy with the way these paper limbs looked. That was all done in a bit of a hurry. So I wanted to make sure that I had symmetrical ash bends, so bending them in twos and adjusting the curves I already had. That was the bendiest piece. I was pretty impressed with how far that could go. So I tried to be a bit braver with the bends and just discard any that weren't, with the grain going across any of those I discarded, and started to pair them up roughly, and then tapering them and making sure they had the right shape in order for them to all fit together. So I just blue tacked those in place, gave them a sand and a little coat of beeswax to make sure everything was going to be all right when I finally attached them. And then just little details like differentiating the handholds and little details with the mechanisms, so it all kind of tied in together. So I didn't want anything to look too simple and then not tie in with other elements. And then last little addition, forgot to take down that sharp right angle from the inner elbow. So that could actually be taken down more. It's another adjustment I could make. But that would just mean the arm could extend. So my first bit of footage is quite limited, but that just helps there. And that is it.